assessments is the broad category of activities that includes audits, it includes internal, informal assessments, but your QA plan has to document how you plan to do assessments and what you're going to do with them. I've done a lot of different kinds of assessments at different kinds of facilities, and they all come down to the same thing, looking at what the documentation is. And the documentation could be this quality assurance project plan, standard operating procedures, checklists, all of those compared to what people are actually doing. And like a home inspection, the auditor or assessor is always going to find something, and that's why you need to look at this as an opportunity for improvement. The number one finding is that there is not adequate documentation. The first thing you have to do is write this quality assurance project plan and make sure that everything you reference in it, including SOPs, actually makes sense. Can people actually do it? When assessments are done, whether they're a formal auditor where you pay somebody several thousands of dollars to come in and assess either side-by-side comparisons of their instrument results against your instrument results, or it's an informal assessment where your supervisor just comes in and says, hey, how are you doing? Let's go over what the status of everything is. As long as you document it, it can count as an assessment, but it must be documented. The first thing to do in terms of writing this section for your quality assurance project plan is to understand what the expectations are for your method. For whatever pollutant you're measuring, there are other people measuring the same thing, probably using similar methods. What do they do? So you want to make sure that in order for your data to be respected, that you conform with what the majority of people are doing for that particular purpose. If you're doing regulatory monitoring, then it's all laid out for you in the Code of Federal Regulations. When an auditor comes in, they're going to be going through the requirements and looking at your documentations, perhaps doing what's called surveillance, where they follow you around, or they just talk to you, or they review all your files. Quality management plan, that's the overarching. It's not usually required of tribal programs because most tribal programs are relatively small, but for larger agencies, when you have multiple projects going on and you have an overall responsibility for the quality of the data that's coming out of, say, your entire environmental department, then there should be a quality management plan that describes who is responsible for the quality of all the data. And if that's the case, then you can refer to the quality management plan. But if you're a smaller agency and you just have one or two or maybe even 5 projects, which you do all of them, then probably you're going to have quality assurance project plans. Standard operating procedures, those are the shorter the better, unless you have pictures, which are awesome. And the auditor, especially if the SOPs are referred to in this QA plan, are going to look at those SOPs and assess whether or not they're being followed. The first thing that do as an auditor, assess the consistency of the quality system documentation. So that includes this QAPP, it includes quality management plans, it includes anything that those reference, specifically checklists, data validation report, templates, and SOPs. So a lot of times it's easy to get inconsistency between these different items of your quality system documentation, which is why it's really important to try to make them as short as possible. And if the requirement or the description or the procedure is laid out in another document like the SOP, don't repeat it, because otherwise you'll have to go back and make revisions to both of the documents. Instead, just refer to the original document where that requirement or procedure is laid out. So that makes it a lot easier to revise the documents when something changes. Because the other thing to keep in mind is that your procedures are not static. You're going to be constantly finding ways to make improvements as technology changes, as your understanding of your system changes, as your environment changes. These are going to be changed, so write them with that in mind to make it as easy as possible to make revisions. Another thing that is a requirement of any program where the data are going to be validated and compared against other people's data is that you have to have at least some independent QA function. And it's really pretty much necessary in terms of peer-reviewed, scientifically respectable data, that you have a second pair of qualified eyes review your data. That's one of the reasons why tribes and other agencies are encouraged to form primary quality assurance organizations, which are consortia of different agencies monitoring for the same pollutants using the same methods. And that way you will be able to share expertise about what constitutes valid data and what doesn't. But in terms of what the auditor is doing, and when you're writing your QAPP in terms of the assessments, you need to factor in some independent third party, somebody who's not going to get fired if they find out that half of the auditor data was faked or something like that. That's what the independence is for. So what needs to go in this section in your QAPP? Well, a list of the assessments that you're going to be doing and their definitions. For example, are you going to be assessing the actual numeric values produced by your equipment and produced by your QC devices? And are you going to hire an auditor to come in with equipment not calibrated against the same standard your equipment was calibrated against, to do a numerical quantitative assessment of the performance? Or are your assessments going to be all paper audits where all the documentation is reviewed and maybe people are followed around and they're watched to compare against their QA requirements, but the actual data isn't compared with the instruments? So that's why the definitions are needed. If you're monitoring to compare against a standard, then there should be requirements associated with that method for what assessments need to be done. You need to describe who is responsible for planning the assessments. Is it the EPA regional office, or is it your office who's responsible for paying for them sometimes also? Who's responsible for doing them and who's responsible for documenting them? As much as possible in this section in your QAPP, refer to the documentation. That way you don't have to repeat in here what each assessment is going to cover. If you have a description, a checklist, an SOP, keep in mind that emails are great. So email yourself, CC yourself on emails to your supervisor describing an informal assessment that you did when somebody from ITEP, say, came and visited and you described your system and it was discussed. You document that in an email to yourself, especially if stuff comes up, which it always will for any discussion of what any of us are doing about how improvements could be made. Document that. That counts as an informal assessment. And keep in mind that the number one finding of all audits I've ever heard of is inadequate documentation. So you really can't document enough. When data are questioned, 2 items of documentation where one corroborates the other is excellent. Like an email saying, I appreciate our discussion on the phone today, and then you've got the record of your telephone conversation described in an email, and say you've got your telephone log right there. So more documentation is always better than less documentation. And then finally, what is the point of doing all this, right? Close the loop. Every assessment is going to come up with something that could be improved. Who's responsible for doing that? You don't have to talk about in lots of detail about how that's going to be reviewed or anything. Just think about in terms of who is responsible for doing it, how long after an assessment is the deadline, it's usually 30 days, and what improvements could be made, and then changes in the documentation. And just describe that in element 20, refer to outside documentation that you have as attachments to your QAPP as much as possible. That way you'll have to change this less when inevitably your procedures will change. So this section, depending upon how many different kinds of assessments are expected for the method that you're using, might not be more than a few pages. Yay!